Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Phil Jones. I'm the technical editor for ProjectorReviews.com, and welcome to our first Fall Projection Summit. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, Sony, for helping us put on this event. Without their help and their support, this would not be possible. So speaking of Sony, joining me today is my buddy, Rob Brennan from Sony Electronics. Hey, Rob, what's up, man? How are
Oh,
you
just
doing,
living the.
sir?
I'm doing well, living the dream out here in relatively smoke-free Texas. Hope that you're doing well, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk to you and your audience about projectors and technology and everything that's going on these days. It's always an exciting time to love projection, but it's obviously great to be able to bust into my theater room since I've been stuck at home for 7 months and be able to mix up my experience every now and again.
Exactly. So projection has always been close to my heart. It's I've always got to hang out with Rob a lot, and it's fun to hang out and talk about their latest new additions to their projector lineup. So Rob, you guys actually just released a couple of three new projectors. You want to really
Right?
quickly kind of give us an overview of these?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, we have these three models that are coming out. They're actually two of them are right around the corner. They're going to be available in mid-October, and that is the VPL-VW715ES and the VPL-VW915ES. Now, those two models replace models that are currently in our lineup. So, for those of you that are somewhat familiar with the product lineup, maybe your customers or your dealers, the 715 replaces the 695 and the 915 replaces the 885. So basically, we have a step-up lamp-based projector that is coming in, and then our entry laser. In addition to those two, we've also introduced a brand new flagship model, which is the VPL-GTZ380. So this is a true new addition to the lineup, and it's really we're going to talk a lot about kind of the nuts and bolts of things that are going on in projectors and technology. This particular model is kind of a beast unto itself. It
Yes,
is a
yes it is.
10,000 lumen laser projector with a red blue laser light engine that
Mhm.
enables it to achieve DCI P3 color at D65 and still maintain 10,000 lumens without the need for a color filter. So
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that in
yeah, it's a,
hyper
it's a,
detail. Trust me.
it's a,
But
it's it's a monster.
yeah, exactly. So I have been lucky enough to be playing because I live in San Diego, and Sony's very kind to me to be able to play with several of their models. So I was one of the first to have the opportunity to do the a review on the VW915ES, which is the model that I have here for us today. So we can go through and do things like explore the menus. Um, to summarize the review, it was probably one of the best pictures I've ever had in my theater the entire time I've ever reviewed. It is an amazing unit, and we'll talk about why. In addition to the model that I have currently here, the 915, we're going to be releasing our 17 our VW 715 review. Hopefully by like Sunday or Monday, so you guys can find out about those models. But as we go along, Rob and I are going to talk about the differences between these three models
As
and
well
what
as some of
makes them
the
so special.
year-over-year changes, which I think is
Exactly.
important as well. Yeah,
Exactly. Because if you look at them on the outside, they may look very similar to what you saw last year. So if say you look at the a 915, it looks very similar to what the 885, Rob? Is that the model number?
that's
Eight,
right.
okay. And the 715 looks a lot like the 695. But what really makes it special is it has a bigger, badder brain. And we're going to talk about that. But this real basic,
Right.
so the step up from the 715 to the 915, the main things are the laser light engine and
Absolutely.
what else?
It really is the laser light engine is the star of the show. Now, being a laser light engine does give you a couple other benefits, as I'm sure most people that have been around projectors for a while understand. With a lamp-based projector, there's no dynamic ability to turn up or turn down the power going to the lamp. You're kind of at fixed brightness. Now you can use a mechanical iris to somewhat limit the output depending on the scene, but largely you're at kind of a fixed brightness output. But with lasers, we can dynamically dim or increase the output depending on the scene. So overall, the dynamic range increases because in addition to the mechanical iris, we have a dynamic light source. But primarily, the difference is the convenience of a laser itself. So you're talking, 20,000 hours compared to a lamp, which is going to get you about 4,000. And also, lasers, just like lamps, will lose brightness over time. But the amount of light that you will perceive to lose during the 20,000 hours for a laser is very minimal, and it maintains color fidelity in a much more stable way than a lamp, which would probably require you to go through at least, every several hundred hours or so and check colors to make sure you haven't drifted too far and so that you're still maintaining color accuracy. With lasers, it's not something you typically have to think about. Yeah. So they're just the native benefits of having, that technology are fantastic. Generally, what I tell customers is if you're looking for like a replacement for a television, if you watch a projector like every day, this is your thing. Lasers give you a lot of those benefits. If you're more of I use a projector for only kind of special events from time to time, a lamp is probably a fairly good match for you as well. While the laser gives you a little bit better performance, a lamp is not going to hurt you in any way. If you're looking at, I watch one movie a week. Friday nights is my movie night. The lamps are perfectly reasonable for what you're trying to achieve in most cases.
Yes. And like I said, to me, that's one of the things that I like most about the laser is I don't have to think about it. Like a TV, like a regular LCD TV, if the kids leave it on a couple of extra hours, who cares? But when you're talking about bulbs that are costing a couple of $100 or several $100s, you really start thinking, how long is it on? Did the kids leave it off? I can't play it right now. Maybe I shouldn't use it during the day because it's, all of that stuff. And that whole thing kind of goes away. And the fact that you can precisely control its output makes the whole concept, when you combine that with like the dynamic iris that is in the 915, I think that's what makes it look really, really good, is that dynamic iris and the ability to modulate the laser light engine really gives you better control over the blacks. So dark blacks are blacks, and it's noticeable that benefit. So if you're looking for better blacks, better brights, and reliable, and just the ultimate in like maintenance-free reliability, 915 is great. You will have to pay a premium because it's double the price, but you're gonna have. But for many people, just to have that additional performance and convenience, it's worth it. It's worth it to them.
And I'll point this out. This is just you do pick up about 11% brightness. For me, 11% is not something I'm writing home about. For all intents and purposes, they'll work on the same size screens. So largely, it is about the convenience and about a little bit better performance. It really applies more to HDR than anything else. But I agree with you completely, Phil. That's how I typically look at the two models.
Yes.
My 915 is still in the hallway along with 7 other projectors. I give getting dirty looks from my wife.
Well, I got a few.
I don't want to take them upstairs. It's too many.
I have a bunch of Sonys. I have projectors everywhere. My house is buried in projectors. But hey, that is a rough life to have, Rob.
It is.
Too many projectors for the screens that you have. We can't complain about what we do for a living at all.
That's
so when you look at a 915, it looks a lot like the VW885.
And yeah, absolutely. The chassis is identical, and
exactly.
The feature set and the connectivity, all of that is going to be the same. And we'll get into the brain, but that's what's changed.
Yeah, and that's the biggest thing. What has changed is the brains that are found in these new units. They have a different brain. And I used to be with Sony back in the days, and so that's why Rob and I know each other so well. And even when I was there, Sony is always promoting that what separated products had to do a lot with the processing. It's almost like, because we always had an analogy, Rob, about the recipe, a chef and his recipe. Do you remember that? Do you remember that analogy?
Yeah, I remember your recipe. You can give your roadkill to a professional chef, and they'll make a gourmet meal out of it.
Exactly. So the biggest thing is you could have the same light source. You could have the same type of imager. You could have the same theoretical specifications, but it's the brain that determines what it looks like and how it's going to perform in a real world environment. And a lot of times, like if you look at it, so I'll give you an analogy, an example. OLED TVs. There's only basically one company that makes the panels for all the OLED TVs, but all those OLEDs look different. Why? Because the processing and the recipes that everybody uses with that panel, the brain and all the other things they add, changes the characteristics. So when I look at,
yeah,
go ahead. What are
go
you going to say, Rob?
continue, please. No,
When I
I was
look
just going
at
to
last
comment
year's
and you
model,
keep on going.
yeah, keep going. When I look at last year's model compared to this year's model, on paper they're the same, but they look different. So
Yeah, absolutely. And again, when you think about processing, right? You know, as consumers are largely familiar with the idea of processing. We have processors in our smartphones and our tablets and our laptops and our computers, and we typically think of processors make things go faster. And the benefit of having advanced processing, in a display is that it doesn't make things go faster. Movies are going to play at 24 frames per second. You don't want them to play any quicker than that. But the idea is, with a more advanced processor, with higher speeds or better efficiencies, it can spend more time on each frame of video doing a deeper analysis. So it can make better decisions, right? Because every piece of content you watch, I don't care how good your source is still, an iteration on what the actual creator, kind of put down. When you take a look at what's, raw coming off the camera, you're looking at something that's maybe 40, 50 megabytes per frame. And you take that and you say there are 24 frames in a second and 60 seconds in a minute and 2 hours in a movie. And that's like 4 terabytes. But my 4K Blu-ray disc is 50 to 80 gigabytes. So every piece of content, even the highest quality, has gone through significant, compression. So being able to spend more time analyzing the frames and the scenes and say, what is it we're looking at? What is it the creator's trying to achieve here? And making the best use of our resources, we get closer to what the creator is intending for us to look at. And that's the benefit really of advanced processing is the deeper analysis and better decision making.
exactly. So so this year you guys added the X-1 processor, which is normally found on your that was originated on your high-end
Right.
LCD and OLED TVs. So like we always talk about that chef. It's easy to make a really good meal if they're giving you fillets and lobster tails. It's really hard to make a good meal when they're giving you know oxtails and pig ears. So
When,
so a
when
lot of
everyone
times,
streams when everyone streams a Mulan, the second it comes out, your individual results are going to vary, quite wildly. And so, those are kind of the experiences that we certainly have found.
exactly, and that's one of the biggest things when you start seeing that starts separating products when we talk about performance and real world is every, 4K Blu-ray. My Kaleidoscape that Andre Floyd and Kaleidoscape loaned me, that looks good and it's consistent. But when you're watching something on an Apple TV and your kids are playing PlayStation, or you're watching a broadcast show and you don't know how it was down converted or up converted or whatever they did to it, that's where the processing separates itself. So there's two things you would talk about here. Let's talk about this reality creation thing first, which has to do
Sure.
more with upscaling, right? Because most stuff we watch right now is in HD, and then we'll go
Yeah.
into this HDR thing because that's where we go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah,
So let's
that's
talk
what
about
we're gonna put on your boots. We're gonna be out playing in the rain and the mud. Yeah, so super resolution. Sony for a long time when it comes to our processing, whether it's flat panels or projectors, has the technology we call reality creation, and it's largely a database of what things look like. And that comes from the fact that Sony not only builds the gear that studios use to make television shows and movies and video games, we also are a primary supplier of 4K cameras for live sports. In case you remember what those used to be, so we're involved in the capture and the acquisition, the distribution, in case of Blu-ray, the compression of all of this content. And so we basically curated this database so that we can compare what it is you're looking at on the screen that's gone through various levels of compression and kind of getting messed with. And we can ask the processor, what is this? What should this look like? Is this noise? Is this film grain? Should I sharpen it? Should I discard it? And the processor is designed to make those decisions. And so, reality creation has been a staple of what we've been doing for a long time. The idea of super resolution reality creation simply indicates that because the processor is more powerful, because it's more efficient, we're actually analyzing now down to the pixel level. So we're comparing for every frame of video, every pixel, with all of the pixels along the horizontal, vertical, diagonal axes, and then well as temporally. So we compare that same pixel over multiple frames. That will tell us if something is noise, right? It keeps on changing every frame it's moving around. It's like, oh, that's probably dot crawl or block noise. We can make those determinations. So now that we can analyze down to the pixel level, we can more accurately identify not only what the object is, but things like noise, issues due to color banding, poor chroma and luminance subsampling issues, and we can make those adjustments. It does primarily benefit non-4K content. However, it's easy to test. You can go into the menu on the Sony projector under reality creation, and you can do a little test, and it will toggle on and off in 1 second increments until you disable the test feature. And so even with 4K, Blu-rays, something is there and it happens. But admittedly, the biggest benefit comes from non-4K sources. And what's really important as kind of the industry moves not only through what's happening right now with the pandemic and everything else, we've already been moving as a society toward a more digital, streaming-based, services. So this issue is going to become more and more, impactful. You even take a look at, I jokingly mentioned Mulan, but that was a test by Disney to, release a premium piece of content on a subscriber service. You have, I think, MGM did it with Trolls World Tour, and you got Zack Snyder with Warner Brothers that's going to do his version of Justice League only available in streaming. You can't go to the theaters and watch it. And so the idea that more content will be accessible this way, and how we treat that content becomes more and more impactful in terms of real world in performance versus theoretical performance.
And yeah, so we do have to make sure that the most of the stuff that you're going to be watching, which is in HD or streaming content, like most of that is just in 4K, looks its very best. And there's lots of processing and stuff that's been working on. The newest thing and the hardest thing for a projector to do is HDR. And basically, no projector, no consumer projector can reproduce all of the brightness found in HDR content, period. Okay. People go, well, I went to a movie theater and they do it in HDR. Well, what the movie theaters do is they know that there's 2 dual Christie projectors on this exact screen, and the colorist masters the content specifically for those two double stack projectors in that screen. So when you watch it, all the highlights are there, all the details. They basically make all the decisions that a home projector would have to make. When you buy a piece of HDR content or watch a piece of HDR content from Netflix, Amazon, Kaleidoscape, Blu-ray player, that was mastered for a much, 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 much brighter flat panel TV. It's not the stuff. And now the projector has to make some really, really hard decisions.
Right.
How am I going to fit all of that information in what I can do? And there's a million different ways to do it. And but you're going to have to compromise or make adjustments somewhere. And that's where processing really comes in. A big brain makes better decisions. So
right,
so
I think the most, and I just want to reiterate something you said there. I think it's incredibly important. Whenever we're taking HDR and we're figuring out how to manipulate it off of the ideal, EOTF 2084 PQ curve into a consumer display, we have to make some type of determination. It's interesting. I used to get this question a lot, in the early days of HDR. I still get it occasionally. And even with Dolby Vision, reviewers would call me and they'd say, "Hey, I got this piece of Dolby Vision content. I got these 2 televisions, one from Sony, one from company XYZ, and they have the same peak luminance, but the content looks different." And I'm like, well, yeah, the manufacturer gets to go in and make a determination to say, how do we want to handle this particular problem? And Phil, you brought up another great point. All HDR is mastered for flat panel. the biggest challenge with projector is that there's no mastering process for a projector. And of course, if you think about it for more than 5 seconds, it becomes obvious why this is so challenging. All of us on this call today, we could all go out tomorrow and buy the exact same projector, whether it's Sony or somebody else's. And unless our throw distance and screen size and aspect and gain and whether that screen is perforated or not and the age of the lamp, all of those conditions are the same, our actual HDR experience is going to be different because a projector is just one piece of the system. I love Sony TVs as well, but I always joke, oh, a TV, that's just a bundled projector. That's just, I don't want to think about it. So I just, give it to me all at once. Include the audio or the interface and la, 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 la. But a projector requires you to build it as part of an overall system. So, but to answer your question, Phil, so part of Sony's philosophy basically boils down to this. Even with televisions, but much more so with projectors, we have this problem of limited dynamic range relative to oftentimes the source, right? So in the case of consumer OLEDs, so we'll talk about this just real briefly. Consumer OLEDs are typically associated with cinephiles, right? If you're a hardcore PQ enthusiast, chances are you look really seriously at consumer OLEDs. And a consumer OLED is going to give you a max luminance of, let's say, 700 nits. Anytime you have HDR content that calls for more than that, you got to make a decision, right? What are you going to do? You can dynamically tone map the 1,000 nits asked for in the content down to 700. You could do that, but it does take you off of the ideal curve, and it does start to brighten certain elements within the image. You can hard clip, right? You can run right to 700, and you can just chop everything else off and say, I don't care about you. Everything on the screen is perfect, but my highlights are gone. You can actually do a little bit of the both as well. And the real trick is that there's not a right answer. Manufacturers tend to have a preference. Largely speaking, Sony's preference is we're okay with some clipping. We're more interested to ensure that the intention of the scene, right, what the director is actually shooting, is maintained accurately. Like right now, you're looking at Phil and I, and you might have noticed my zombie head cookie jar back there. That's not the point of this shot, right? That's it's funny and people generally point it out. I'm like, oh yeah, but that's not the purpose. So if that's super bright and that's a highlight, that can add ambiance and maybe a little bit about me because it's back there, and maybe you see my Lord of the Ring Blu-rays, and maybe you see my PlayStation and my Xbox because I can't decide. And you might learn something about me. It adds to the ambiance of the scene. But the point is, unfortunately, this guy right here. And so, we're okay largely if we have to lose some of the highlights to achieve the director's vision for the thrust of the scene, we'll do that. But it's not as simple as saying, hey, we don't do any dynamic tone mapping or we 100% do hard clipping. It does depend on the scene. It does depend on the brightness requirements asked for by the source, the dynamic capabilities of the display, and then we make that decision in real time, on a scene by scene kind of basis. And that's basically what HDR contrast enhancer is. Sony has a long history of coming up with very long interesting combinations of words to describe a thing. I'm thankful that the process is called X-1 for projector. So it's clear that, it's in the projector. But this image that Phil brought up, this is just an example, again, of how the previous processor would compare to the X-1 for projector in terms of the ability to analyze a scene, right? And to make a better decision per HDR, because I'm taking more measurements of what's happening, the interplay between the brightness and the darkness, where clipping is going to happen, where the average kind of frame level is going to be. So we can make the best determination in that given scene on what we want to do. But again, the big takeaway here is if you're looking at a Sony display and you see clipping, that's not an indication that there's a problem. That's an indication of a choice that we've made. Now, Sony has a perception, and I'm certainly wearing a Sony shirt. I'm happy to acknowledge that other manufacturers may have a different philosophy. And if you as a consumer ultimately have a preference, more power to you. But ultimately, what we're trying to achieve at Sony is with HDR, how can we most accurately represent what the creator is trying to tell us. The other thing to keep in mind when it comes to projectors, because I mentioned OLED, 700 nits of brightness, so let's just carry that thought through. I know Screen Innovations is one of the other sessions you're having, and they're down in Austin. I work a lot with those guys. And I know from working with them that the most common screen size they sell here in the States is 120-inch diagonal, and it's 16 by 9. And I know that it's a 1.2 gain. That's their bread and butter, right? And so if we assume that screen circumstance and we take a 715ES projector, the resulting brightness on screen is going to measure around 130 nits. And so now you got to ask yourself, I put in a Blu-ray that's calling for 4,000 nits or 1,500 nits or even 1,000 nits. What do I have to do when my dynamic range might be limited by something that's 1/10 of what the source is asking for? And that's where we have kind of a blended approach. Some clipping certainly can happen, but we're more interested in the main thrust of the scene being accurate.
And that's one of the things that when I hear people say, well, you can tone map it all in, you can't. Okay. So there is 10,000 steps of brightness. There's 4,000 steps of brightness. You're not going to put all of that information. Actually, you can. And the way that they do it is if you ever watch a cinema camera, they shoot in what's called log, S log, red log. They shoot in what's called a log. And what log does is it completely flattens the image to capture all of the brightness in the scene in a camera's limited range. But when you look at it, it looks washed out. You see all the shadows, you see all the highlights, but it's all in there, but you have to flatten it to make it fit. So, and most people, you want to see to get the same effect on your projector, turn your contrast in HDR, take a 10,000 nit recording, turn your contrast all the way down to 0 and turn your brightness all the way up. I guarantee you'll see everything. It'll look just like log off of an SDR, off of a cinema camera. So you have to make a decision.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, if you take a look at the PQ curve, it's also logarithmic, which means that the value steps as you go up in sort of signal brightness don't equally equate to steps of actual optical brightness on the screen, right? You get this diminishing turn. That's why the curve has got this weird shape to it, depending on whether you're looking at EOTF or OETF, doesn't matter, right? And so what ends up happening, right, as you compress that down, you start to change the shape of the curve. The curve no longer has this nice, deep kind of bow to it, which is what gives you the impact of the highlights and the shadow detail. It starts to flatten the curve out into a little more of a straight line. And it looks like the SDR curve. So too much of this tone mapping can take your great HDR content and ultimately result in what essentially is an SDR type of experience if you have sufficient dynamic range in your display and the source is asking for a sufficiently wide dynamic range in terms of the content. And again, that's why Sony wants to take all that into consideration. Because you can't. You could absolutely tone map everything down. You could hard clip everything down. But the result is, while that might look good on a test pattern, Sony's not interested in making display products for the purpose of looking at test patterns. We make movies and TV shows and video games. And when you think about the time and effort that's used to produce, whatever your favorite movie is, I can tell you that the director of photography and the colorist spend hours on every frame of video agonizing over what it's going to look like. And it's important that we get that experience or as close as possible to what they're trying to say to the consumers that want to spend their hard-earned money and their time to access that content.
Okay, so and the other thing too, so you're saying that you analyze the signal and then you make a decision on how to do it. What can I keep? A hard decision. What do I keep? How do I roll it off? And that decision varies based on the scene and based on the analysis of the brain. Hard decision by a big brain. Now, the next thing is the brain also controls things, works in conjunction with some of the hardware in the projector, the dynamic iris, the modulated light source to do some more stuff. And so, can you talk about what this particular slide is talking about?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So up to this point, we've largely been talking about signal manipulation, right? Manipulating, a curve. basically the transfer function. We're changing kind of, the axes of where we're plotting kind of points along the luminance scale is really what we're talking about. But we can also say, okay, if we have a relatively dark scene, like this image here is a random picture of a sun. Okay, we've got dark elements. We also have a bright, punchy highlights. So one of the challenges that projectors can have in general is very similar to direct backlit LCD televisions, right? Absolute black is tough, right? You're asking this tiny, 0.75 inch LCD screen to block, a very bright bulb that's just, baking it away. And so what we'll do here, in addition to signal manipulation, is then mechanical manipulation. So we can clamp down the iris, which will limit the amount of light that comes out, but the light that comes out is still really intense, if that makes sense, right? And then understanding how that manipulation of the mechanical iris changes the dynamic range available within the scene, we will then tone map the highlights differently to maintain, intense colors rather than allow them to go white. Because that's the other trade-off that you have is we close down the iris and we drop that dynamic range lower, right? We improve black level, but we also drop peak luminance, right? That's affecting the color intensity of the highlights. And so then we readjust the curve again based on now a mechanical. So it's this fine-tuned adjustment. It's kind of like, you're driving down the road and you got to keep yourself between the two lanes, right? And if you drift a little bit this way, you got to go back and then you got to pull back. So we're doing both in conjunction. And if you add the dynamic laser for the laser-based projectors, then that's another layer of physical control. Again, we can say we have a dark scene, so we want the iris to clamp down, but the highlights are very bright, so we want to have very punchy light coming through it. The opposite could be true, right? I have kind of an average scene, but I have shadow detail. Well, let's open the iris, but lower the laser. So all the light comes through, but I'm dropping some of the intensity so you as the viewer can perceive shadow detail. And we'll make those decisions in real time. And what's interesting is, a lot of people look at metadata and they're like, oh, it's frame by frame analysis. Sony is looking at each frame, but we're really doing scene by scene adjustments, right? One of the ways that you can test this is if you watch, let's say, a movie like John Wick Chapter 2, right? He's down in the catacombs. Ruby Rose hasn't betrayed him yet, so there's no gunplay. It's a dark scene. Well, you don't want to tone map every frame because as soon as they start shooting each other in muzzle flashes, you'd have these wild swings. So the brain is reading multiple frames ahead to say, what is this scene? What are the brightest points in this scene going to be? What are the darkest points in this scene going to be? And I'm going to set not only my tone map, but also my iris and my light output based on the scene. And then we'll readjust once we get to a different scene.
Yeah, so I'll show you guys. We're going to show you guys a little later because I actually have a projector. So we're going to go into the menus and show you some of these new settings that they've actually added to the projector this year, but along the way. But I actually, when I had the 715 and the 695 together, I actually put them side by side and I shot some photos. Now, of course, it's impossible for me to put it for all of what I saw to be shown in a photograph. But it was pretty obvious. It was pretty obvious if you look at like the highlights behind him, the extra detail in the scene that it. And a lot of remember a 695 and a 715 hardware wise is very, very simple, very close.
Similar,
it is the brain, very similar. It is the brain and how the unit is looking at these scenes, these scenes, scene by scene, that make that determination. And believe me, if you just look at a 695 by itself, you'll be like, wow, that is an amazing machine. Yeah. Until you sitting next to a 715. So the processing matters, and the processing does make a noticeable improvement on these HDR scenes. So that first scene is a scene out of Aquaman. So and then here's another scene out of Aquaman. If you look at the highlights way off in the distance, so the scene maintained its brightness, and it also maintained its highlight detail in this extreme scene that I was playing with. Now, each manufacturer has their own way of trying to achieve these goals. This is Sony's approach.
Right.
We can argue, and I'm sure other people are going to come in here and say my way is better, and Sony's going to say their way is better.
And we should argue. We certainly should. But yeah, that's ultimately the decision that we have to make. A scene like this, it's the highlight is important. It adds to the ambiance. But the point is, at least if you ask my wife, the point is Jason Momoa.
you asked my wife too. Like, look at the highlights. He's like, what highlight?
My wife's like, quit adjusting the picture. I'm trying to watch this.
Yes. Actually, before we go into the big guy, let's play with the menu system a little bit. Because like I said, I have the projector here. Yeah. So Rob, hide your camera. The little green circle with your camera on it. You see it? Mm-hmm. Okay, make it go away. Bye, Rob. Okay, so those new settings. Oh, let me come back. It's so funny. I'm pointing it at this remote control. Go here. Go over. Go down. So that is located. Those new settings are located under Cineblack Pro. Why did they put it under there, Rob? How would I know that the dynamic enhancer is under the Cineblack Pro? Bat Sony. Put it on the main.
Yeah, I'm going to mute myself and I'll take my loss.
Put it on the thing. So there's three ranges. What do those three ranges give me? Because there's low, mid, high. So off, if I turn it off, it looked just like a 695. When I turned it on or went to even from low, noticeable. And then as what is this doing? What is this changing as I go through low, mid, high?
So essentially what this is doing is it's determining the percentage of tone mapping to clipping that happens. Mm-hmm. So how you're going to perceive this as a viewer is as you move up and down, the average picture level is going to move up and down. But effectively what's happening is we're making this kind of trade-off. If the average picture level goes up, clipping also goes up, right? Mm-hmm. And that's basically the kind of the trade-off that you're making there. So it's basically taking the curve and deepening it or straightening it, which is a function of how much tone mapping we're asking the projector to do. So that's really what's happening there.
Okay, and then of course your iris and your dynamic, so your iris control as well as your laser light output is here. And then once you set this, this works in conjunction with so you say, okay, don't get too crazy with with the iris control, and I want the max brightness on my bulb. Then the dynamic HDR kind of uses that your preferences to try to do what you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that under the iris there, if you just go back to the iris where I think it's under limited, this isn't really what we're talking about, but just the difference between limited and full. Full dynamic iris means that the mechanical iris will run through its full range from as wide open as possible to as closed as possible, and it will react relatively quickly for scene changes. Limited is basically going from, let's say, 10% to 90%, and it's a little bit slower to respond. So we've done a lot of work over a lot of years to reduce what some people have affectionately referred to as iris pumping, or the ability for you as a viewer to perceive that the scene changes, and then there's a brightness change right behind it. And so if you're still very sensitive to that, this is a place where I would go in and change it. In most picture mode, it's set to limited by default.
Okay. The other question, dynamic HDR enhancer, but you also, when it's an HDR, that comes up, and then you have dynamic enhancer when it's just SDR. So it's two different settings, right? Okay. So
correct.
Two different settings doing different things.
And that setting exists in this point in the menu. It's just a question of if the projector detects an HDR signal, you are making changes to its HDR tone mapping. And when it detects an SDR signal, you're making, again, kind of similar changes. It's a digital manipulation of the signal to affect overall contrast. And those settings are persistent based on the picture mode. So if you want to sit here and say this is film mode 2, and you make a change for HDR, that change will apply every time HDR content comes through.
Okay, and like I said, when I calibrated it, and when I've been looking at it, I've been leaving it in the middle selection, and then I went in to just like there's 2 dynamic enhancer settings, there's 2 contrast settings, one for SDR and one for HDR, and a lot of times that has an effect on the highlight clipping as well. And I found that if I run that, when I set it to middle for dynamic HDR enhancer and contrast at about 47 to 48, whether I was looking at 10,000 nit content, 1,000 nit content, or 4,000 nit content, I didn't find myself wanting to go in and adjust. So that was kind of nice as well. I will tell you that on the remote control, what I like is there's a button on here called Contrast Enhancer. So if you do want to adjust it every once in a while because you're watching something and it's like, for example, Rob, Stranger Things. Stranger Things, I have to hit the high button every once in a while. I have to go into this thing and hit the high. So there were some shows that I would want to go in and hit that button, but 99% of what I was watching on Netflix or Amazon or Blu-ray or my Kaleidoscape, I didn't find the need to. There was not a lot of excessive clipping, so I didn't feel like I had to go to low. But normally I would find myself maybe wanting to jump to high just for, I'll give you a couple of things. Stranger Things is one. A lot of the Universal or the Marvel movies, Captain Marvel, you want to, it was nice to boost it a little bit. And a few other shows on Amazon. On Amazon, but 90% of the time I didn't feel like I needed to push the button.
Yeah, part of what we're still finding is that directors are largely still learning about HDR. In fact, I was surprised to hear this. Sony Pictures Animation had a meeting about a year ago. The last time I was allowed to leave my house, and I didn't realize that a part of their main function is to convince directors what HDR, what benefit it can bring, because they don't know how to use it. You have to remember, right? HDR is simply an additional resource that a director can use to make his vision or her vision, come to life. There's no such thing as, good HDR or bad HDR. You might look at a piece of content and be like, I don't like this director's style, right? You might watch, what was it, episode 3, season 8, Game of Thrones, and you may go, okay, this director of photography and I are not going to be friends, and that's okay. But you need to avoid kind of getting into a space where you say, I got this new 4K Blu-ray movie, and this director, the peak luminance in this entire movie is only 600 nits. That's not real HDR. It's like, it is. They're looking at a scene. No director sits down in front of their professional monitor and says,
"Come back, Rob. I want to see your beautiful face."
Sorry, I'm coming. So, a director, a director won't sit in front of their monitor, right? They're looking at, let's say there's that great scene in Wonder Woman when Gal Gadot comes out of the trenches, right? She's blocking the bullets, and they do the slow motion, and there's the big sparks coming off. It looks awesome. No director is stopping it right there and saying, I don't care what she looks like. Just make sure that spark is 2,500 nits, because someone told me that's not how this works. And I'll remind you of one other thing. There's a danger, I think, within the industry in general when technology becomes the hero rather than the art form. Do y'all remember 3D? 3D failed because it was a technology first, art second. It doesn't matter what the story is. Just make sure you're throwing stuff at the audience.
Okay. Now, Rob,
that's the challenge we have.
Now, of course, we could pontificate for an hour, but we're getting close to the end. I'm going to ask you, we have a kind of a after hours, after party thing that if you want to go in there and talk to Rob, and Rob will hang out with you as long as I would hang out with you in this room. But there's a couple things that I want to point out too, because you have another projector for that person that says, what if I want all that brightness? And what if I want all that thing? if you're willing to write a big check, they got one coming for you. So,
Certainly do.
so this one is the GTZ380. I am Nobu, I know you're out there. When is mine coming? I want my projector. If I have to rewire my house, I'm ready for it. Okay. So the thing that we talked about this 3 lasers. Instead,
Right.
most of these laser systems use a single laser or hey, there's Andre.
I'm saying, get back in here, Andre.
He used to do. He knows this as much as we do. But they normally have a single laser with a phosphor wheel or a. So Andre, he's an ex-Sony guy. He's going to be in to talk about kaleidoscope. But this is a 3 laser, which means 100% DCI-P3 at its full brightness, which is crazy, considering it's 10,000 lumens, and 100% when you add 100% DCI-P3 with 10,000 lumens of brightness, you're looking at an insane amount of color volume. I actually did a calculation, Rob, on a 100-inch screen. With no 100-inch screen with a gain of 1, or basically no gain.
Unity screen, right?
This projector will do over 1,000 nits on screen. Now, when you watch a movie, by the way, and I look at it, look at the same movie on a 715 and the same movie on a 915, if both there's a fixed color brightness for each pixel on that scene. If I set my 715 to be reference mode and I played a pixel that was 78 nits, it's 78 nits on the 715, it's 78 nits on this sucker. It's just that when it does not need to clip. This does not require any tone mapping for content under 1,000 nits, which is just outrageous. How much is it going to be, Rob?
Well, we haven't, and I hate to be the guy who keeps on saying that. We haven't actually announced the final pricing on it yet. We're pretty close. It'll be announced here relatively soon. But the projector itself will be available mid-January, maybe third week of January is when we're going to see it. So it's going to fall into the next calendar year. But again, kind of what really sets it apart, what enables us to do this, just real quick, is because we're using the red laser, we don't need to use a color filter. And color filters the thing about color filters is that's not something that Sony likes to use in our projectors. And again, I'm not here to talk about other manufacturers, but like the 295 or the 715 or 915, the reason those are listed at 15, 18, or 2000 lumens, respectively, is because we don't give you this option where it's like, oh, no filter, pure brightness. It doesn't matter what the picture looks like, pure horsepower. We just want the brightest image on the screen. Picture quality becomes a secondary concern. And I'm not here to say that doing that is a bad solution, but Sony's looking for a very particular kind of performance. So if you're saying what I need is this crazy dynamic range, the GTZ380 is going to be the piece that doesn't offer color.
Now, hopefully you're going to come back and we're going to talk in detail about the GTZ380 when you come back. But I will tell you that it even has an even bigger brain. So if the X-1 has a master's degree, this has a PhD. So not only do you have this insane amount of brawn and capability, you also have an even more powerful processor. So what's the code name on this thing? It had a cool name. Was it the Raptor?
It was the Raptor.
Okay. So Rob, thank you very much for coming. I got to cut you off because we only got 45 minutes. But you and I, you're going to come back on Saturday and we're going to talk more about the custom integration features, about anamorphic lens capability and lens shift and all that stuff. And we could probably continue a little bit more about if some people have questions about color filters. And
we'll take the conversation wherever the audience likes. I'm happy to do it. Thanks for having me, Phil. It's always good to see you.
Thank you, man. It's gonna be a blast.